that the evaluation should be integrated with the planning of the initiative, so that the goals for the initiative are clearly understood from both. Yeah.
Kelly, let me interrupt you for a second here. Just a few minor technical difficulties, but we should be okay now. So let me run through the welcome here. Welcome everybody to ILA's 2009 webinar series. My name is Josh Tarr. I'm a staff member here at the ILA, and I will serve as moderator for this presentation. Today's ILA webinar presentation is sponsored by ILA's Leadership Development Member Interest Group. The ILA has 5 member interest communities where members with similar passions connect with each other. To learn more about these, log on to our brand new website, ila-net.org. Today we are excited to have Kelly Hannum from the Center for Creative Leadership presenting Evaluating Leadership Development, the Missing Ingredient to Understanding and Achieving Success. Kelly's a manager of research for the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region at the Center for Creative Leadership. She holds a PhD in Educational Research, Measurement, and Evaluation from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She was the lead editor for the Handbook of Leadership Development Evaluation and a guest editor for the forthcoming special issue of Leadership Quarterly, which is focused on evaluation of leadership development. She's also the recipient of the Marcia Gutentag Award for the American Evaluation Association and Young Alumni Awards from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and Guilford College. One logistical note before we begin. We will pause at several points during the presentation to take questions. So to ask a question, type it into the question box of your webinar controls. Once submitted, I will receive the question and pose it to Kelly during these breaks. Since Kelly's unable to see the audience, we'll just assume that you're smiling and nodding along in affirmation, and we hope that you demonstrate your engagement through questions and that you submit many questions. So without further ado, Kelly Hannum and Evaluating Leadership Development.
Thanks, Josh. What I'm hoping to do through this presentation, this webinar, is to help you understand and use leadership development evaluation to achieve success with your leadership development initiatives. Naturally, it's a very broad and complex topic, and I'll only be able to address very key elements of the process. But at a minimum, I hope that at the end of the session, you understand the purposes and value of evaluation, know the roles of an evaluator. We'll be able to use different frameworks. You'll be able to ask different key questions and have a broad perspective on the connections between evaluation and leadership development. Before we get started and into the content, I thought I'd share a little bit about my perspective on evaluation, and it's one I share with my colleagues here at the Center for Creative Leadership. And that is that evaluation should help people and organizations make informed decisions about improving leadership development initiatives, examining the degree to which goals have been met and accomplished, and also to look at what work remains to be done in order to achieve the broader goals identified by different stakeholder groups, and we'll talk about the process to do that a little bit later. More specifically, in terms of CCL's values around evaluation, we believe that evaluation should be a collaborative process, that ideally evaluation would be integrated with the discovery, design, and delivery processes associated with the initiative. And what we mean by that is that as you're planning and thinking about your leadership development initiative, you'd concurrently be planning and thinking about your evaluation initiative. And there are a couple of reasons for thinking this. One is often when we get into the evaluation process, especially if it's after the fact, that's the first time that stakeholders have really sat down together and talked objectively and specifically about what they're trying to accomplish and how what they're doing is connected to how they're going to accomplish their goals. And you don't want to find out much after you've already designed and delivered something that there's a disconnect. We also believe that the evaluation should be ideally focused on the objectives and outcomes of an initiative. That doesn't mean that you ignore the process of the initiative, but rather that you make sure that the processes used are connected with some overarching objectives and outcomes that are intended. Given our learning orientation, we believe that evaluation should provide feedback in the moment, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But basically, evaluation data should not be held in some sort of vault until the end of an initiative, but rather there should be an inclusive process built in throughout an initiative to provide feedback to people so they can make programmatic changes. And finally, we believe that evaluation should create an overall picture of program impact as well as create learning about initiatives. Some of the reasons people choose to evaluate leadership development are to demonstrate the benefit of an initiative, which is probably the most common reason, to improve initiatives, to demonstrate impact on specific goals. And how that's different from the first point is that sometimes there'll be multiple initiatives all geared towards a common specific goal, and you want to know the contribution of just this piece. Evaluation can also help promote learning-centered reflection and providing the data needed to spur and inform reflective practices. Also, evaluation can help you pinpoint contextually important competencies. And what I mean by that is you can use evaluation to help you determine what aspects of leadership development initiatives are giving you the most benefit. Most of us are working or operating in situations where we don't have unlimited resources. In fact, we often have very limited resources. And evaluation is one tool you can use to help figure out how to pinpoint the use of those resources most strategically. And ultimately, evaluation helps encourage discussion about what works in a program and why it's working. So we talked a little bit about why people evaluate, but another perspective is considering what are the dangers of not evaluating or the consequences of not evaluation, to sort of turn the perspective a bit. So if you don't evaluate, you won't know if an initiative actually achieved what it was intended to achieve. You won't be able to inform stakeholders, and therefore they can't use evaluation results in their planning processes. You won't learn any lessons that can improve the program design and possibly the program implementation. And probably most fearfully, you won't be able to support continued or future funding more than likely, because you won't have data documenting what's working and why and the impact of that. And you also will not be able to most likely you will not be able to adequately inform future leadership development initiatives. Some of the roles that evaluators play are the planner and designer. That is, often they'll help with the leadership development planning and designing process, as well as the evaluation planning and designing process. Having both the instructional designer and the evaluator working together can really supplement a leadership development initiative, and it's a role evaluators often play. Another role, and one probably people commonly think of evaluators playing, is that of the assessor, and that's the person going in and really assessing the situation through gathering qualitative and often quantitative data. Given the resource not rich context we're often operating in, evaluators tend to be capacity builders. Most programs, leadership development programs, don't have the resources to support a full-time evaluator, so evaluators, often external evaluators, will work with program staff to help build their internal capacity to evaluate their leadership development and other programs. And because evaluators work with many different stakeholder groups, they often become a translator and a boundary spanner among those different groups, trying to find the common message and help people understand the different perspectives on the leadership development initiative and the evaluation. One role evaluators play that's sometimes often difficult, is that of an advocate. Being an evaluator, one is often in the position to have information about the program that often and hopefully can serve as in an advocating capacity for the program's merits. The caution there is that you don't want to seem, or you don't want an evaluator to seem terribly biased, and obviously you don't want them to be actually biased. But it is a role that evaluators sometimes play. And finally, evaluators play the role of reflective practitioner, both in terms of their own practice, but also in helping teams of people really reflect on their practice and move forward in their thinking around leadership development initiatives and the consequences of them. So just to give you a quick overview of the territory we'll be covering today, I'm going to cover three very broad and basic components of evaluation. One is focusing the evaluation. The second is designing and conducting the evaluation. And finally, communicating and using the evaluation findings. So that's sort of our framework for the rest of the presentation. And we'll take a quick pause there for questions. Josh?
Great, Kelly. Thanks. Just a couple quick questions. The first about the roles that the evaluator plays. Could you talk a little more about the capacity builder role and how one best about goes about achieving this role?
Mm-hmm. Sure. One way is by using inclusive and collaborative processes that I mentioned earlier. And that is the evaluator being explicit about what's happening and why with the evaluation, including various stakeholder members in the planning and the conducting, and really the thinking through of how an evaluation will happen and why different decisions are made and how they're made. Sometimes evaluators will be a bit more specific and actually hold workshop sessions with stakeholders where they are taught how to do the evaluation, and the evaluator is then there just as sort of a resource or an advisor. Obviously, the approach will depend a lot on what the existing capacity is within the organization or institution. But in general, I'd say the most common processes are really advising and coaching and being explicit about the evaluation process itself. And that doesn't only help build capacity, it also helps make sure that everybody is fully understanding and buying into the evaluation process itself.
Question coming in is, Kelly, what recommendations would you have to someone who is forced via the lack of resources that you referenced to develop, implement, and evaluate a leadership development initiative?
Well, it's tough, and a lot of people are in that situation, to be sure. One approach might be to contact a local university or college that has a research methods or an evaluation program or series of classes, and see if the instructor for that class or the professor for that class might be willing to use your program as a test case to help students learn the evaluation process themselves. Now, obviously, you're still going to end up spending a lot of time describing your program and working with the professor or instructor and their students. But often they'll be able to do that work, or frequently they'll be able to do that work pro bono. You're not getting, a full-on professional evaluation, but you're probably getting more than you would if you tried to do it yourself. Another approach would be, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is really trying to hone in on what specifically absolutely has to get accomplished by the evaluation and putting processes in place to do that. And there are some efficiencies that we'll talk about later in terms of including evaluation processes along with the leadership development process, so you're getting sort of two bangs for your buck, so to speak, where you're getting a measure that not only informs the program but also informs the evaluation. So that's my quick advice.
Okay, and a last question for this particular section, but keep sending them in and we'll get to them later, is, Kelly, one of the other roles was that of reflective practitioner. So how do you encourage or improve reflective practice by the provider and from participants?
Part of that can be done at the, depending on the situation, but most likely at the end of a leadership development cycle, or if it's a single initiative at the end of the initiative, and bringing all the stakeholders, or at least the key stakeholders, back together and really talking through the evaluation data, what happened, why it happened, has it changed anybody's thinking about what needs to happen, has it changed anyone's thinking about the processes used to achieve the goals, and perhaps in some cases the goals themselves, and really the evaluator serving as a facilitator of that conversation, and ideally using the data that they've gathered to sort of prompt a deeper conversation and deeper reflection about the leadership development initiative itself and sort of the undergirding assumptions behind it.
Thanks, Kelly. Everyone keep sending your questions in, and we'll make sure to cover them in our other question and answer breaks. So, Kelly, back to you.
Great. So in terms of focusing the evaluation, if I can get the slide to advance, there we go. There are a couple of key questions and broad questions associated with this phase of an evaluation, and they are figuring out who the primary stakeholders of the initiative and of the evaluation are, and we'll talk more about each of these. You also want to think about what's the broad goal that's being addressed or being sought by the initiative. More specifically, what are the initiative's objectives, and how are those objectives connected to that broader goal? Critical is understanding the context in which the initiative is being delivered. One aspect of that is really looking at the cultural relevance and responsibility of both the initiative and the evaluation. I think most of us pretty fully understand that the same thing will not have the same effect in a different place. So really thinking through What are the contextual elements that are important, and might that make us think differently about the evaluation process and the leadership development process itself? And then finally, and absolutely, if there's one thing you do, and this can really help sort down what absolutely has to happen, and that's thinking about how is this information going to be used. And that's really a key question as you think through the focusing of the evaluation. If there's something that you're gathering that you really don't understand how you're going to use it, and it's taking resources to find out, that's kind of at least a yellow flag, if not a red flag for me. Yes, it's interesting, but we don't have a lot of resources, and do we really need to know that? And if we know that, what would we do differently, or what would we do with that information? If you can't answer that question, it's probably not data you really need to invest in collecting. And after all, gathering data that's not going to be used wastes resources, not only money and staff time, but also the participants' time in completing or providing the information. So when we think about the stakeholders, I have brought these two pictures up to sort of illustrate two things. One is the picture on the left sort of has people all together in calm waters rowing in the same direction. So sometimes your stakeholders really are pretty clear about what needs to happen, how it's going to happen, and what the end state is. And they're paying attention to the process, and they're going in the same direction. That's sort of the ideal and in most cases, highly unlikely situation. More often, it's more sort of the picture on the right with people, yes, they're in the same boat, but they're kind of looking in different directions, and they're probably paying attention to the context, and rightly so. But they're probably paying attention to the context so much that they might not be paying attention to how they're functioning as a team or how the initiative is functioning as an initiative to get them to where they need to be. So some of the common stakeholders of leadership development initiatives are organizational executives, program sponsors and managers, the participants themselves, the evaluators, HR or training managers, the managers or bosses of participants, mentors or coaches for the participants, very often external funders, program designers, and sometimes board members or other groups. Now the reason to think through who the stakeholders are, or one of the reasons to think through who the stakeholders are, might there be different perspectives about the leadership development initiative goals? Might there be different assumptions about what's going to happen and why? It's important to understand all that early on in the process, and it's also important to understand what are the expectations of the evaluation. Are they expecting financial impact information? Are they expecting some nice anecdotes that really illustrate the evocative impact of leadership development? So kind of thinking about it from those different perspectives can help think about the evaluation needs. The next sort of big step in focusing the evaluation is thinking about where are you going, not you specifically, but the leadership development initiative. What ultimately are people hoping will happen as a result? Not just that 24 people will go through a leadership development program, but why? Why spend all this money? Why spend this time for these people to go to this program? What's the big impact that people are looking for? And as you do that, Kirkpatrick's levels of impact, and it's called different things, can be a really helpful tool to help you think through the different kind of levels of impact, but also the different levels of evaluation data, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, that you need to gather. The first level, sort of the base of the pyramid, are gathering participant reactions, and most programs do that, and it's sometimes frowned upon, but it is an important element to understand, are the participants perceiving value, and are they satisfied with their leadership development experience? So to the next level, the orange level, is learning. So what did the participants actually learn as a result of attending leadership development initiative? We'll just assume, okay, so they had a good time, they're satisfied with their experience, but what do they know now, or what can they do now that's different than what they knew or could do before? The third level is the beginning of where the rubber meets the road, and that is, are participants able to transfer what they learned in the initiative to what they need to be doing differently in their context? So be it at work or in the community or wherever transfer needs to occur. Is it occurring? Are they using what they learned to make a bigger difference, which leads to level 4, and that's results. What are the bigger changes? So they're doing things differently, but does it really matter for the organization, or does it really matter for the community? Many of us, me included, would like to get a lot more for our investment. And one consequence of that is sometimes we have really unrealistic expectations of leadership development. So this figure is one that is sometimes helpful for me and my colleagues when we talk to clients, and that is, if you really want big change, integrated systemic change, it's going to take more time. So you really need to think through logically, what's the level of impact we want, and realistically, how long is it going to take for us to get there? And that will inform not only the leadership development initiative, but also your evaluation. Is it reasonable to assume that a half-day training session on perhaps coaching or giving feedback is going to lead to long-term systemic change? Probably not. So you probably don't want to measure change at that level. You probably want to measure more at the awareness level, that they know some new frameworks, they know some new skills, and that's about the most you could hope for in most cases. So once you sort of decide where you're going, the next obvious question is, well, how are you going to get there? How does your leadership development initiative get you towards that end state? And there's a couple of pictures of different ways to get places, and obviously there's no one right leadership development path. There are many ways, and so it's just about choosing what to do. And at this stage is when people typically focus in on the specific objectives of the initiative. And here are some areas. You might not need to go through all these depending on how complex your initiative is. But here's some things to think about. One is identifying the focus of change. So who or what is changing? Are you changing maybe individual managers in a specific unit? Are you hoping to change government leaders? Who needs to change to get to that broader goal that you've identified? The next step is specifying content domain, which is kind of a fancy way of what kinds of things do you want to change? Are they learning conflict management skills? Are they learning coaching skills? What's happening? The next is articulating the type of change, which is integrated with the content domain, but slightly different in the sense that if we take conflict management as an example, are you hoping that they'll learn new conflict management strategies or that they'll build conflict management skills? What's the type of change that you want to see happen? And then again, the level of change, and that sort of harkens back to the diagram I shared earlier with the arrow running across. Are you just building awareness, or do you really want to try to foster integrated and systemic change? How much change is expected? And then obviously indicating the change trajectory. When do you expect that change? Should it happen right after the program, or are participants going to need a little time to have some supportive practice and to really try things out before you want to go and measure whether or not the change has occurred, or the extent to which the change has occurred? So some of the evaluation activities, or reasons people would evaluate, are to track the inputs into the program. And sometimes that's neglected, but it can be very helpful, especially if you want to weigh the impact versus the input. So that could include the number of people, monitoring the number of people attending the program, how much things cost. So you can say at the end, well, we've got this impact, and it costs, overall, both indirect and direct costs, it costs about $100,000. Is this impact worth that investment? And it's a judgment call. And for leadership development, we tend to shy away from formulas, although there are many formulas out there to help people calculate return on investment, and they're different formulas, but that's probably the most frequent one. Some of the other evaluation activities are measuring satisfaction. Normally, that would be participant satisfaction. Assessing skill or knowledge acquisition, and that harkens back to that question about what do people actually learn and what can they do differently. Monitoring the behavior change and the performance changes in participants, and sometimes those around them. Determining the results, the end-state results, and then more broadly tracking the goal achievement. So these little things have happened, or these little differences have been made, but ultimately, how does that inform our broader goals? And in a nutshell, that's pretty much the focusing the evaluation activity, and I covered a lot of bits there. So Josh, why don't we stop and get some questions?
Yeah, a lot of bits and a lot of questions coming in, Kelly. So the first one, is the evaluator only to evaluate new initiatives, but initiatives also that have been in place for a while and in need of evaluation to determine their effectiveness?
I'd say both. I don't know that being an evaluator, it's hard for me to say there's ever a bad time to evaluate. But certainly with new initiatives, it's a little easier to combine the evaluation planning activity with the initiative planning activity. But certainly there's a case to go and conduct evaluations of initiatives that have been going on for a long time, sometimes because no one's ever looked at the impact of those, and it's kind of hard to understand, well, is it worth us continuing to invest in this? And then other times, maybe what works in a context, 5 or however many years ago, is no longer really seeming to get the impact, and maybe you don't really have the data about it, but people just sort of feel like this isn't working for us anymore. That's kind of another prompt to say, well, let's look at the situation. What's really happening here? What can we change? Or is it time to withdraw effort?
Another question from a participant who's conducting leadership training in the Arabian Gulf. So from a cultural perspective, Kelly, how do you see the model that you're talking about? Do you believe it is universal, or is it more Western specific?
It's definitely coming more out of a Western context, I'd say. And being someone who is highly sensitive to culture, and not only national culture, but many different types of culture, I would hesitate to say anything works anywhere. I do think, broadly speaking, these are the key components of an evaluation, but certainly the type of data people are willing to provide, the notions of confidentiality vary greatly across national culture, the degree to which people feel able and are able to be open and forthright about their experiences, which is part of what you're asking them to do in a data collection effort, is going to vary a great deal. As are the people who are sort of have the authority to conduct evaluations and have the authority to make certain things happen. That's going to be different in different situations. So I wish I knew the final answer to that, but I don't. That's sort of my take on it at the moment.
Great. So the next couple questions, Kelly, is about evaluation specific to the field of leadership. So first, how is evaluating leadership programs different than evaluating other types of training programs in general?
I'd say the biggest difference, and people doing other kinds of evaluation would be able to successfully argue with me on this, but leadership is a pretty nuanced concept, and it's really difficult to get all the stakeholders around the table and objectively identify, what do we mean by leadership? What do we mean by leadership development? What's going to be different as a result of having better leaders, no matter what they look like? Tying those two things together I think, is much more difficult than determining, have students, and I'll use a K-12 example, have students learn how to do their computation, have they learn computational skills in their mathematics class. Leadership is broad, and it's really tied into, I was going to say often, but I could almost say always, issues around power and authority and resources, and it can, as many of you probably know, it can incite some really emotional conversations, and as well as conceptually complex conversations. So I think for that reason, it's a little bit more challenging, to me anyway, than other types of program evaluations, and that for me underscores the need to include the stakeholders early on, as early as possible and as fully as possible throughout the process, because the assumptions of what's happening and why are a lot fuzzier with leadership development.
Talking about stakeholders, Kelly, this attendee asked, in stakeholders it appears the perspective is focused on formal leaders. Does this evaluation model translate to informal leadership development as well?
Depending on, I'm definitely a researcher, depending on how those terms are defined, it might. What it doesn't apply to, there's certainly life events and things that people do that are informal that help develop their leadership, intentional or not. It's really difficult to plan an evaluation for those things because you may not even be aware that they're happening in the moment. So in the sense that initiatives are planned, then yeah, this approach is only going to work for intentional leadership development. It doesn't necessarily mean a formal training program where people come to a class. It could include what could be termed informal processes like rotational job assignments to help broaden people's perspective, things like that. So hopefully that answers the question. If not, then ask again.
So more questions coming in that are pretty based about the measurement and assessment, and I know you're going to get to did we reach our goals in the next section?
Yeah.
So I'll hold these questions for the next Q&A break. So back to you.
Great. And Josh, if I don't answer them, ask them for sure.
Will do.
Great. So now, as Josh said, we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty, designing and conducting the evaluation, or at least as much as I can talk about in a short time frame. And in this phase of the evaluation, you want to determine specifically what data are going to be gathered and from whom are we going to gather these data and when. It's a good time to start thinking and confirming, do we have the resources we need? What are the expectations, and can we meet them? And if you can't meet expectations, and sometimes you can't, especially with the resources you have, it's a good time to kind of have the conversation and really sit down with stakeholders and say, okay, this is what we have, this is what we can do. I'm open to other ideas, but this is realistically the expectation I think we can achieve. You also want to plan for data treatment and storage, which sounds really boring, but it is important because you want to make sure that the data you're gathering can be stored in a safe location in order to protect confidentiality, which is often promised to providers of data. So you want to make sure other people can't access people's data, particularly if it's in a politically charged situation. And you also want to make sure that data are stored in a very organized fashion, that you can link data. One of the saddest things is where people have gathered all kinds of sources and types of data, but they're in different places and there's no way to link, Kelly Hannum's data from the post-program survey to Kelly Hannum's data on the learning survey. Obviously, you would then be ready to gather the data and, of course, analyze and interpret the data. So one way to put all that together in one location so people can kind of get a quick overview is in a sample evaluation plan. And the one on the screen now is just an example. There are many, many, many ways to draw up a sample evaluation plan. This is just one, and it includes some of the key components. That is, what are the broad evaluation questions being asked? These aren't the specific survey questions, but rather, what are the big questions the evaluation is seeking to answer? And then, what's the time frame of the evaluation activities, and what are the data collection methods being used? So, for example, evaluation question 1 is about the learning objectives, and I can look at this table and know that, well, in January we're going to do a survey of P, which stands for participants, to get some data around that specific evaluation question. And just gives a quick snapshot for stakeholders to see what's happening when and why, and how is it connected to our broader questions. Next, and maybe this is when I'll answer some of the measurement questions, how are you going to measure progress? And there's some evaluation suggestions that we would offer up. And one is to examine impact from multiple perspectives. Again, going back to the many stakeholders in a leadership development program, they're going to have different perspectives, and so you want to gather data reflecting those different perspectives. Many leadership development evaluations and many program evaluations in general only gather participant data or self-only data. And sometimes that's all you can do, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but if you can, and in many cases it makes sense to, maybe talking to the people around the people in the program, and maybe including program staff and faculty could be an important source for data. Another suggestion is to assess different types of change. One reason for doing that kind of goes back to one of my answers before, and that leadership development is pretty complex and nuanced. So you probably want to cast as wide a net as is logistically and reasonably possible to look at the different kinds of change, which means using multiple data collection methods. And we'll talk about some examples of some of those. So you might want to use both surveys and interviews, or at a minimum, some form of quantitative as well as qualitative data collection method. Another suggestion is to look at change over time. And that's somewhat related to using a time series design for comparison. What you want to do is track the learning trajectory. Leadership development isn't one of those things typically that you go to a 3-day program or a half-day session and then bam, you're a great leader and everything's different. It usually takes some time. So kind of gathering data that show that learning trajectory, that change trajectory can be really helpful. And it also may help prevent people from looking at only one form of data at one point in time and saying, well, not much is different, so this program isn't working. Well, maybe it is working, but it just needs a little bit more time to work. Another suggestion, and this one's difficult to implement, is using control groups for comparison. In most cases, or rather in a lot of cases for leadership development, it's really hard to identify a control group. However, for large-scale leadership development initiatives where the group of people intended to go through the program have been identified and they're a large group, you can kind of randomly select some of the people from that group who aren't able to attend the leadership development initiative at the same time as the others to be sort of the control group for those who are going through the program at an earlier stage. So you talked about time series. I'll sort of skip over that and go right to conducting a pilot study. And there's lots of ways. You don't necessarily have to do a fully implemented pilot study. It may be something as simple as talking to a few program participants or getting some sort of impact or input into the data collection process to make sure that the questionnaires or the survey questions or the interview questions you plan to use are going to make sense and get the data that you need. In terms of the common evaluation data collection methods, here are a few. These aren't necessarily or aren't the full scope of everything you could collect, but these are typically the things we use and we see other people using with regard to leadership development. One is something called an expectation survey, and that's something that goes out before the program. It can go out to participants in the program as well as others around the participant, perhaps their boss or their manager. What are they expecting as a result of the program? What do they think they're going to get out of it? That can help inform the program in cases where their expectations don't really match the design. Well, that's a good point to figure out how to get those two things closer in alignment. Another collection method used frequently are daily evaluation surveys. So if you have a multi-day program, you could do short evaluation surveys at the end of each day to get a sense of how things are going and maybe what needs to be different in the next day if there are needs that aren't being addressed. Very frequently, people use an end-of-initiative evaluation survey. Are you satisfied? Do you intend to apply what you learned? Those sorts of questions are frequently on an end-of-initiative evaluation survey. Some of the other forms, and I won't go through all of them in detail, but doing interviews, conducting learning surveys, change surveys, culture surveys, less frequently but very helpful behavioral observations about what's different in the different contexts leadership development is operating in. Focus groups, which is one way to get the richness of interview data, but more efficiently, often. And another place to look are business and community data. The advantage of that, of these data, which is they're archival data, they're already being collected. You don't have to gather these data other than going to the source that has already been gathering them. The downside is you want to make sure that the data you're looking at are actually logically linked with your program. So maybe you can get your hands on some financial data, but there's no reason to think it would be different because of your leadership development program. So you might not, you wouldn't want to look at it in that case. And here's just sort of a quick look at some common metrics organized by Kirkpatrick's level, which was that triangle we looked at before. So if you want to look, for instance, at the reaction level, one method is the end-of-program survey, and then some questions that could be on that survey are around participant satisfaction, intent to use content or what they learned in the program, ratings of facilitators' knowledge and skill. And I won't go through all of those in the interest of time, but would be happy to answer questions. One thing I want to touch on briefly is measuring change, and this is definitely an area where leadership development is more complex, or at least as complex as other areas. And so I want to share just quickly 3 different ways people tend to measure change. And if you have specific questions about these, I'd be happy to answer them. But one are using pre-post initiative ratings, and that is how am I doing or how is this person doing, depending on the type of survey. Before the initiative, and they would answer the questions, attend the initiative, and then a separate survey would be sent later, or a separate data collection effort would happen later, and say, okay, well, how are they doing now? And then those responses would be compared. With leadership development, it can be hard to get the same people to provide the ratings in many cases, and the specificity with which you can ask changes in leadership is difficult. So comparing pre-post sometimes, it always has a bit of error associated. I'll just say it that way. Another approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is using a retrospective pre-post test rating system, and I'll say more about that in a second. But basically, it's just administering one test that on the same form asks, how is this person doing before, how are they doing now? And then finally, sort of skips the pre-post, is looking at the degree of change ratings, and that's where they don't look at now, or before versus now. They just say, okay, this person has gotten this much better, or this person has changed this much in this area. So if we think about retrospective, here's one example. It's one of the center's assessments called Reflections. You'll see in the middle column are lists of different behaviors. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a rating scale for before the initiative, and then on the right-hand side, a rating scale for now. One advantage of this type of approach is that you can interweave it with the leadership development initiative itself. So participants get feedback themselves, which informs their leadership. How am I doing with regard to my goal? What changes have I made and I can celebrate? And what things have I been focused on but haven't really changed, and so maybe I need to get some more information, or I need some additional support. And it gives you the evaluation data. So that's one example of how you can kind of interweave evaluation processes with leadership development processes. And then finally, looking at all this data, analyzing them, interpreting, and then comparing them back to what was intended for the leadership development program. Was the goal reached? To what extent? What else needs to happen? And Josh, we'll take maybe a quick break and some questions now.
Yeah, that sounds great, Kelly. Thanks. So some questions regarding pre- and post-testing. First, what is your opinion on pre- and post-testing as a tool? Is it effective? Because this participant says, sometimes we see better results sometimes in a pre-test than in a post-test. So what's your opinion on pre- and post-testing, Kelly?
I wish I had an answer. It's one of those things that is really complicated. There's positive sides to it, negative sides. So what I'll do is just share a little bit about my thinking with regard to that. One reason that you might see better results on a pre-test than on a post-test, so from a programmatic perspective, it looks like things got worse because of your leadership development initiative, which could happen. But another possible explanation is that people, as a result of the leadership development initiative, change their perspective of either the behaviors being asked and or of the rating scale. So an example of that might be, let's say, I'm going along, Kelly, I'm going along about, going about my business, and I think I am a fantastic provider of constructive feedback. Given the opportunity, I would rate myself as outstanding. I go to a leadership development program, I get some ideas about what effective and constructive feedback looks like, and I get some feedback from people who have received what I had thought was great feedback from me in my role, and it's a little bit different from what I thought. So I would change my rating of myself to say, oh, maybe I'm not outstanding on this. Maybe, this is something that I really do need to get better at it. My actual behavior or skill hasn't changed, but my concept of it has. And in terms of the pre-post and retrospective pre-post, it's an issue that's been addressed very recently in AEA, the American Evaluation Association's journal, so that would be a great resource to go to really get the in-depth and empirical approach on that. So that's my answer.
Great. Another one on pre- and post-testing from a couple people is before and after 360 competency assessment, so using the 360 tool, is that a valid way to measure results for pre- and post-testing?
Well, one complication is what I just talked about, response shift bias. And then another complication with regard to 360 data specifically is that getting your hands on the same group of raters is really difficult. So for instance, the person's, often people going through, if they're in an organizational setting, the person going through a leadership development initiative is a high potential, high profile manager or executive. By the time you go to re-administer a 360, they're in a different position. They have a different boss. They have a different group of direct reports. So you're not able to access the same group of raters. And that obviously has an impact on the validity of those data. I won't say that they're never valid, but I can definitely tell you they're not always valid.
A couple of questions about timing. So Kelly, what's the optimum timing for those 4 levels of evaluation that you mentioned? Reactions, learning, transferring results?
A lot of that will depend, obviously specifically on the objectives of the Leadership Development Initiative and the timing of the Leadership Development Initiative itself. Because, there's a huge amount of variability in how leadership development initiatives are delivered. ranging from, you know, a 1-hour workshop to things that are multi-phased and multi-year in nature. So with that in mind, I would say level 1, sort of the reactions, you probably want to measure that as close as possible to the end of the initiative or the end of an initiative component that you're interested in. In terms of learning that and skill change, that could happen, depending on what it is, anywhere from very shortly, within a week or so of the program, to you know, weeks to months after it. Probably not many months, though. And then results and change is definitely, with leadership development, most likely it's going to take time, so at least weeks, if not months. The problem you run into is, if you're anything like me remembering something from a year ago is difficult. So you know, you want to think about what contamination factors might be at play in terms of how, to what extent does it rely on the person's memory and ability to tie some sort of difference to something that happened at some distant point in time. And obviously there are other factors at play. For example, you know, the economic changes being one that most people are experiencing, and those are going to have an impact, or are likely to have an impact on certain kinds of results.
Great. Another question, Kelly, is this participant says, you know, when we're trying to define learning outcomes, we find ourselves becoming too much specific sometimes and oversimplifying the possible outcome. So how could we achieve assessment without overlooking the real outcome?
Part of that, I think, is using different sources for data, and perhaps using a mix of things that are very specific and other sources that are less specific. So that's one way to balance it. But there is sort of this tenuous balance between, you know, getting objectives down to something that you can clearly measure, that makes sense to everybody, that is small enough you can kind of get your head and your hands around it, versus, well, why are we really doing leadership development? It isn't for this little tiny, you know, dot of a learning objective. It's really for this bigger change that we want to see. So, you know, maybe stakeholder A or so is not going to be satisfied with these detailed changes. They're really not what they're interested in. They want to see the big change. So there's this toggling between specific enough that you can kind of accurately measure it and measure it in an objective way, and then big enough that it really gets at what's the heart of this leadership development initiative, what's the big change, what's the big goal that we want to see. But usually the big goals are squishier and less, you know, kind of more difficult to measure. So that's my answer.
All right, great. Well, Kelly, the questions are streaming in, so let's move on to the last part of your presentation, and then we'll take a good amount of time for these great questions.
Okay. So the last phase is communicating and using the evaluation findings, and that involves obviously effectively communicating the findings, identifying specific courses of actions, in many cases developing a detailed action plan, monitoring the action plan and the implementation of the action plan. The evaluator may or may not be involved in that step, but if you've got a plan, somebody needs to be responsible for making sure that it's actually being implemented and leading to the results people want. And ideally, using evaluation to create broader change and learning. You don't want evaluation data to be isolated, or it's often not the case that evaluation data should be isolated to a very small group of people. It's something that can be used to help inform people, help people learn it, and create that broader change people tend to seek with leadership development. So, quick picture of what I think is a bookbinder. It's not just the message, but it's also the method with which, or the methods that you use to convey the message. So some communication ideas are in a final evaluation report. This is often really important to document the process of the evaluation, get all your findings together, so there's one source that really can answer anybody's question about the initiative or the evaluation if they come in 5 years, you know, from the time it was conducted and the staff's different. The final evaluation report is probably not something most people are going to pick up and read while they're at the beach or on their summer holiday. It might not be the best communication approach to really get the word out there about specific things that are good that are happening, or specific things that say, hey, we thought this might work, it didn't, but we think this is going to work. Some some other communication ideas, and I'd be interested to hear what other people have used successfully, because I think this is one of the most difficult parts of an evaluation. But some other ones are using newsletters or incorporating evaluation stories in existing newsletters, using visual or photos, or videos to show what's different as a result, to show the impact. Some of you may be familiar with Heifer International, and I'm not aware of any leadership development work they do, although they may. But they have a sort of a CD/DVD that really shows the impact of their work and what's different, and that's really compelling and evocative for many people. Using postcards, posters in public areas can kind of do a quick snapshot of the story, and then electronic postcards that just give the bullet points or a quick peek at what's happening and what's different and what's the impact. Now finally, evaluation data should prompt people to think about the initiative, what's working in the initiative, what could be different in the initiative, not necessarily that it didn't work, but there's a next step that people could take. And so using those data and using those communication to inform people and to gather input about what changes are desired in this initiative, if it's going to be ongoing, and what changes are needed. And again, that can be both things that aren't working, that people thought they were, as well as identifying areas where, hey, that worked great, and now we need to do this. So I think in the interest, Josh, of answering additional questions, I'm not going to read through all the next slides, but I'll just kind of go through the headlines. On the following slides, which Josh has sent to you, and you'll receive a recorded part of this webinar so you have a chance to see it again, are just evaluation best practices. These are things that tend to be good things to do if you're conducting evaluation. And to be funny, or hopefully funny, I thought I would include some evaluation worst practices. So there are a few things there. And then since there was absolutely no way I could provide even close to the information one would need to really get their head around evaluating leadership development, I thought I'd include some resources. And one is the American Evaluation Association's Guiding Principles, and this just talks about broadly the philosophy essentially with which evaluation should be conducted, and those are the broad areas, and you can go to their website to see specifically what's intended by each. And there are also program evaluation standards. This helps not only evaluators sort of measure their practice against what's standard in the field, but it also can help consumers of evaluation to really look and say, am I getting these things from my evaluator or my evaluation group? And it's sort of a way to be an informed consumer. And again, that's sort of the broad list, and there's much more information on the AEA website. There's some published resources, actually my book, and then many others. The program evaluation, some of these are broad, the resources about evaluation in general, not specifically to leadership development. One exception to that is at the very end, there's the Kellogg Scan of 55 leadership development programs, and that can be really helpful information for people. There's some resources that have all kinds of evaluation tools and information, some more general and some specifically to leadership development. And then Josh, we'll take those questions now.
Great. So keep sending them. We have a lot. So Kelly, first, a couple questions about specific tools. Can you give suggestions on how best to use interviews to measure change?
Gosh, that's a big question. I'd be hard-pressed to really give a good answer to that. There are many interview books, and I'd be happy to provide some recommendations of specific books offline, either through email or on the website, the ILA sort of discussion board about this webinar. In general, I think it's just thinking through those broader issues about who is likely to have witnessed the change or experienced the change. So that's kind of helping identify who to interview. And then obviously thinking about when to interview. When are they likely to have seen, the change or a piece of the change? And then specifically about the questions, obviously that's going to be tied into what kinds of changes are you anticipating or do you intend to see happen. And one of the advantages of an interview is that you can gather information about unintended consequences or unintended change. And so maybe you thought XYZ would happen, and yes, that happened, but so did these other things that you didn't even think to ask about. So having some sort of catch-all or a series of questions that are broad in nature to elicit things that maybe you didn't even think about. And that might include consequences of change that could be positive or negative.
All right, great. Another question about tools. Is use of 360-degree evaluation a valid one for college student participants in leadership development programs?
I think it'd be difficult to identify who would have the 360 perspective. So if these are employed college students, or these are college students that are in some sort of formal leadership role around which they would have peers and a boss, then perhaps my guess is in most cases you probably aren't going to be able to get the rater groups to do like a real sort of, not a real, but what we would commonly think of as a 360. But that's not necessarily a reason not to do some form of multi-source, multi-rater data collection, and it might just be thinking more creatively about who those raters could be and whether or not you really want, need peers and direct reports and that sort of thing. It may be if they're members of youth group or some sort of leadership groups, community groups, getting input from the people with whom they're enacting leadership about their leadership.
Okay, great. Kelly, could you share some experiences about how you do evaluation in different cultures? How do we communicate with them with the evaluation language?
It's hard, and to be honest, communicating in a purist evaluation language, even within my own culture, the American culture, is challenging in and of itself. To the extent possible, I think that's, if you're operating in a culture that is not one that you're intimately familiar with or is not your own, and even if you are, to be honest, it's really helpful to engage different stakeholder groups, and some of the groups that you probably want to look at engaging if you're working in a culture that's one you're not terribly familiar with, are people who are very much embedded within that culture, and you might want to choose a range of people, so people who are of that culture, whatever it is, as well as people who maybe are outsiders to the culture but have been embedded in it long enough to kind of help be a translator between, I kind of know a little bit about this culture and I kind of know a little bit about your culture, evaluator, and these are some of the things you need to think about, sort of play that translating role for you. To the extent possible, and many evaluators are not able to do this for resource reasons, but to embed yourself, to spend some ideally significant amount of time within a culture and really understand what are the power dynamics, what are the dynamics about who provides information and the level of openness with regard to that information. What's their experience been with evaluation? Evaluation, as much as I like it, has not always been a positive experience for people. And, are people overly concerned and rightly concerned in many cases their funding is going to completely go away if they say anything bad? Because that's definitely going to have an impact on your data collection efforts. Have they been promised confidentiality and that's been violated and there have been negative consequences to that? That would be something that would be important to know. To what degree can they trust you? Is kind of the broader question. Can they trust you to do what you say you will do? So it's a big question, and definitely something to think about. And there's a resource, I think it was I could be wrong, I think it's the California Endowment has a freely available PDF about culturally responsive evaluation. And if you just sort of Google culturally responsive evaluation, you'll find resources that will help you think that through.
All right, another question for you, Kelly. While evaluation can often help identify how to improve a program, oftentimes we can be too eager to make changes that we think will help without the data to back it up. What is your take on this?
That's another one of those tricky situations. Coming from the background I'm coming from, I would say if you don't have reason to believe something's not working, then, is it really worth the resources to make changes and the complications associated with making changes to a leadership development initiative? Because it's bound to cause some disturbance in the staff. It's bound to cost a little bit of money, if not some other resource. And so, are you willing to take the risk? Is your funder, assuming that you're getting funding from some source, is your funder willing to take that risk with you? And what are you going to, ideally, what are you going to do to document that whatever change you're making has increased the effectiveness or the impact of the leadership development initiative? But I sort of fall in the middle of, sometimes you do just have to try something a little bit, or not, you don't have to, but sometimes it makes sense to try something a little bit different. But at the same time, constantly changing things around, it takes a lot of resources.
Another question, Kelly, another question is, this participant conducts high-level talent development in Europe and the U.S. So how do you handle pushback to change? So i.e., those who hire and look for changes but not necessarily really buy into it?
That's one of those times where being an evaluator sort of pushes up against the issues of power and authority, I think. There's usually some sort of more systemic rather, reason that espoused changes are not, or articulated desired changes are not occurring, and often it's there's something within the system itself that's not supporting that change or actively preventing that change from happening. The degree to which an evaluator can and should get involved in that conversation is definitely going to vary. But depending on the context, it may be helpful to, if it makes sense, and this can backfire, so I'm not recommending it for everybody, if it makes sense to maybe look into what's getting in the way of these changes being made. And that may not be answering the question, but that's how I interpreted it.
Well, we've hit the end of this presentation, but there are so many questions still streaming in. So here are the ways that you can continue this great discussion with Kelly and the other attendees. So first, there's ILA Space. ILA Space is our new online community for ILA members. Kelly is hosting a post-webinar discussion here. So simply log on to www.ilaspace.org, sign up, and then go to ILA 2009 webinar discussion. So here you'll be able to have follow-up questions to Kelly and some great discussion with your other attendees, all on ILA Space. The rebroadcast of this presentation will be available within the next 48 hours to everyone who attended this webinar. So you all will receive an email with a link to the rebroadcast. You'll be able to see the video of the slides and hear Kelly talk through the presentation. A question we got in was, how are we evaluating this webinar presentation? So you will also receive a link to a survey, so please fill out that survey, and I think from this group we'll get a pretty high response rate. And finally, the ILA itself, if you're not yet an ILA member, I encourage you to go on our newly designed website, ila-net.org, for more information about the ILA, and including our 11th annual global conference in Prague, where great presentations such as Kelly's will be presented there. And you can always contact me personally, Josh Tarr, J-T-A-R-R, at ila-net.org. So thank you for participating. A big, big thank you to Kelly Hannum for giving such an excellent presentation. Looking forward to the great post-webinar discussion on ILA Space, and have a great day. Kelly, thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks everyone for attending.